China stands ready to work with all the other BRICS parties to support the work of the new development bank.
From the BRICS New Development Bank to the threat of terrorism, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa addressed global issues at their annual summit in India. Hello, I'm Nathan King, in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Amid a sluggish global economy and growing threat of terrorism, BRICS leaders meet to discuss how they tackle the challenges they face. CCTV's Shweta Bajaj attended the summit in Goa in India and has this report.
The leaders of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, concluded their summit with agreements on key issues of regional and global importance. BRICS has played an active role in shaping the agenda for change and development. This time, the leaders focused on counter-terrorism, sustainable development, people-to-people ties, and creating new ways to work with traditional financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. The leaders decided the process of institution building in BRICS must continue to remain the focus. A major step was to fast-track the formation of a BRICS credit rating agency to assist emerging economies. The BRICS countries have already set up the new development bank, which became operational last year to meet funding requirements of the members. The countries also decided to establish an agriculture research center, railway research network and sports council. BRICS nations also agreed to increase trade and investment among the members. In 2015, intra-BRICS trade stood at about $250 billion. A target has been set to double the number to $500 billion by 2020. BRICS nations also pushed to increase cooperation at multilateral forums like the G20 and WTO. Chinese President Xi Jinping said, even though the treacherous recovery of the global economy has affected growth among the BRICS countries, the potential of the five-nation group continues to be unchanged. He added that innovation holds the key to leapfrog development and urged businesses to follow this path for sustainable economic development. Shweta Bajaj, CCTV, Goa, India.
Joining me now to discuss the role China and India play in the BRICS is Stimson, a senior associate of the East Asia program at the Stimson Center, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank, and Gautam Adhikari is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, focusing on India foreign relations. Gautam, let's start with you, because obviously India hosting this BRICS summit in Goa. A difficult time for the BRICS nations because of the slowing global economy and also the competing interests of this bloc as well.
Yes, indeed. But at the same time, it must be pointed out that the Indian economy is doing rather well right now compared to several years past. It's actually the fastest growing economy in the world amongst the major economies. And China has, of course, slowed down, but Bangladesh is doing pretty well. And, you know, I mean, generally in South Asia, the economic outlook is not that bad. But that apart, yes, there are tensions within the BRICS political economies, if I can call it that. And obviously, those cannot be underplayed.
Let's go to you. China very much obviously trying to make sure that BRICS is still relevant in the fact that we have this slowdown. Was there enough momentum, do you think, created in Goa to push the BRICS agenda forward?
I think from China's perspective, China certainly would like to have a collective voice among the emerging markets or among the leading developing countries. So there is a debate as well whether China should play a leading role or a guiding role among the BRICS countries. And like you pointed out, there are conflicting agendas, there are different interests, but it doesn't mean that as a collective voice, BRICS has already lost its momentum.
And there is momentum there, isn't it? We've seen the new development bank obviously set up in rapid time, in 3 years, based in Shanghai, headed by an Indian, so this is interesting, making loans. But there were other things decided as well, a new credit rating agency for developing countries, so there is sort of movement on the infrastructure.
There are a lot of movements on the infrastructure development front. There are also, like you pointed out, there is some momentum to calling for more financial capitals to be available to the developing countries, especially for the BRICS countries. There are statements about climate change. There are statements about trade facilitation, about enhanced economic cooperation among the BRICS countries. So there are quite a variety of content coming out of Goa.
Yes, it's a broad agenda. Let's just have a listen to Chinese President Xi Jinping about the agenda of the BRICS.
We have to confront complicated geopolitical factors intertwined with traditional and non-traditional security risks, and also rising global challenges such as terrorism, infectious diseases, and climate change.
Gautam, picking up off that, there has been some suggestion that China, as we just heard from Yun, and India and Russia are mainly in the driving seat when it comes to this cooperation, and Brazil is slightly taking a back seat along with South Africa. I've heard that not BRICS, but RIC. Is that something that you see in this grouping coming apart a little bit, or do you think there's more cohesion?
I think BRICS is a far more fluid and dynamic concept right now compared to what it was earlier, and I do think that China and India, I'm not so sure about Russia's, because Russia's interests are less perhaps in the developing world and the Asian scene rather than the West, and its tensions with the United States and its tensions with Europe. Those are separate things that drive the Russian agenda. I don't think Russia it might be keen on maintaining a strong voice in BRICS, but BRICS itself is relatively weak. And speaking of climate change that you were talking about, China and India have both signed on to the climate accord. And that is done, regardless of BRICS or any kind of united voice in BRICS. I mean, that's China and India working together. I mean, these two countries in 10 years' time will be 40% of the world's population, and probably growing in proportion. I'm not sure about that, but still. But they will also be two of the largest economies. China is already, in purchasing power terms, the largest economy in the world. And India is growing rapidly. And so what China and India do together, I think, is perhaps more important, and maybe in the G20 and forums like that, rather than what happens exactly in BRICS nowadays.
I'm glad you brought up the China-India thing, because Prime Minister Modi actually set a marker down and said BRICS trade is about 250 billion a year now, wants to get it to 500 billion by in the not-too-distant future, 2020. Do you think that's achievable?
I think it's...
Considering we're seeing actually a decrease in global trade now.
Right, but not decrease as far as India goes, and China...
Right.
China is poorly performing at 7%, which is a different way of putting it, actually. And China might recover. And then I think China and India, by and large, will be the driving factors within the BRICS countries. The Russian economy depends a lot on certain external issues like oil prices. So right now, oil prices are improving, so Russian economy will be a little better, but it's not in that great a shape. Brazil is having its own problems. And South Africa is not in that great a shape either. But China and India, I think, have forged ahead in different ways. And there is a lot of Chinese investment within India. Chinese companies are expected to invest about $20 billion worth. Now that's, I think, a big deal. And I think that economic bilateral relationship with China and India are already they're the biggest economic partners as far as trade goes. I think China has overtaken the United States as India's largest trading partner right now. And so I think those are factors that have to be taken into account, and those will count for a lot.
Yun, Jim O'Neill, who was the economist who came up with the term BRICS, has actually said he's more positive about the BRICS than he's ever been, largely because of China's input. What do you think he means by that, and why is China's input so important at the moment?
I thought it was because he came up with the term.
So he wants to keep it going.
Yeah.
He wanted to keep it going. Well, we know that China is faced with its own economic slowdown problem at home, but it doesn't mean that China has been less ambitious coming to its foreign economic cooperation. In fact, there is the argument that now China is looking at foreign markets to stimulate its domestic growth. And when we look at campaigns like the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of that is associated with China's domestic growth. For example, using infrastructure development to stimulate the absorption of China's overcapacity. Of course, there are certain controversies associated with that outside China as well, like India India and some African countries wondering whether China will be dumping its overcapacity in their market. So those are issues that need to be worked out. But for China, this going abroad, this foreign economic cooperation is pretty much seen as a future of China's economic growth. So I definitely think there is a lot of momentum from Beijing, from the central government, to use Chinese financing, to use Chinese capacity, and use the Chinese manpower to stimulate this growth.
And in terms of foreign policy, particularly with the members of the BRICS, Brazil, South Africa, India, Russia, how does that affect China's foreign policy goals?
In terms of China's foreign policy, to have the collective voice among developing countries, especially among the leading developing countries, has always been a key component to China's foreign policy. Because when China looks at the world, they see that there's established discourse by the Western countries, and China, as a newcomer, did not necessarily participate in all the rulemaking. So when China tries to find its partners in international affairs, these emerging markets or developing countries are identified as China's natural partners.
So are these economies the can-do economies of the G77, the 132 member grouping that China's been so part of, or a more workable G20 when it comes to sort of developing countries?
Coming to developing country, China definitely has different platforms. If you look at Africa, there's a FOCAC forum. If you look at the leading countries, there's BRICS, and then there's G20, there's G77. But for China, it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. So all these platforms play their distinct role in China's foreign policy. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Cooperation, but also competition, especially between India and China. Before the BRICS summit, we saw President Xi Jinping in Bangladesh. We also are seeing a more tightening of the relationship between Pakistan and China as well, and a closeness of the US and China as well. How's that playing into the BRICS dynamic?
Well, I personally think that as far as the BRICS dynamic goes, this concept of a collective voice should be separated from the concept of BRICS, which is more of an economic concept than a political platform, really. Whereas the collective voice that China might want in its foreign policy with the developing countries is China's approach, but it is, as you said, there's competition and there's cooperation. I mean, in Africa, for instance, China and India are in severe competition over influence, both economic and therefore de facto political. They are competing in Latin America. Now, China's ahead of the game, but India's catching up as far as Africa goes. So there are competing interests. Then China's interests in South Asia are not necessarily the same as India's in all respects. China's relationship with Pakistan is a sore point. As far as India keeps very wary, a watchful eye over that relationship, because China has both economic as well as political interests in keeping the Pakistan relationship going. Pakistan doesn't have too many close friends in the world right now, but China is certainly, perhaps its closest major international friend. So these are competing issues that are there within the BRICS countries that have to be taken into account. I think 3 international relationships are going to be worth watching over the next 10 years or so. One is, of course, the US-China relationship. I think it's the most important one in the world right now. The second would be the Russia-NATO-US relationship, which also is getting more and more complicated over things happening in the Middle East and other issues.
Yes, of course.
And finally, the India-China relationship, for some of the reasons that I cited earlier, that they would be about 40% of the world's population and 2 of the perhaps 3 major economies in the world. And therefore, that counts for a lot.
Yun, your views on the India China relationship in the context of BRICS and beyond?
In the context of BRICS, well, at least from China's perspective, this is a collective voice among developing countries. So China and India definitely have a lot of common interest. They have a converging interest in having that collective voice and to have their common voice in the international affairs. But I also agree with the view that between China and India, there are certainly a lot of issues of contention. When we talked about the China's investment plan, infrastructure investment in India, or in South Asia for that matter, there are pushbacks from India because India is concerned about the growing or expanding Chinese influence in the region or in their own country. And what does that mean? Does that translate into political influence in India's domestic affairs? So there are a lot of such concerns. And Pakistan is definitely one of the issues, like the mentioning of counterterrorism in the BRICS announcement, in the BRICS statement this time. We know that India pushed pretty hard to include Pakistan in the statement, but China pushed back. And in the end, I'm sure the statement was a product of compromise. But it also just illustrates that there is a level of strategic distrust between China and India. But this is primarily remained in the political field. So we hope that BRICS as an economic platform would be less of a contention on these issues.